Hello and welcome to Africa Today. I'm Vuiswa Ngobongwana, and this is Press TV's weekly look at key issues affecting Africans both on the continent and outside. In today's show, we'll be examining how the Western media portrays Africa. In general, it does seem to be accepted that bad news is what makes the news. And if you watch the Western media's coverage of Africa, you might be forgiven for thinking that Africa is a continent of countries where people are either killing each other, starving to death, or begging for help from the rest of the world. In fact, for a lot of people in the West, the most and perhaps only beautiful thing about Africa is its wildlife. With me to share a more expanded view and to discuss why there is such a narrow focus on Africa are writer and broadcaster Dr. Vincent Magombe on my left and commentator on African affairs Ayo Johnson. And on the phone joining us also is Ebere Nzewuji, the African correspondent for Ben TV here in London. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. I want to start off with you, Vincent, as someone who has worked quite extensively with the mainstream media, especially the beloved BBC, depending on your perspective. Now, why is it, do you think, that we see such a plethora of negative images, poverty and death?
It cannot be something that is done sort of by mistake. It is something that is an agenda-led, I believe. I mean, it's agenda-led, but it's also almost intrinsic. It's something entrenched into the culture and traditions of the BBC or Western media.
Yes.
They have particular sort of ways in which you have got to represent the other. Very different from sometimes how they represent themselves or Western society. I'll just give you one little example. A few years ago, I had a wonderful discussion, a debate, actually, public debate, with a columnist of one of the big newspapers here, in UK. He had written a book about Liberia, so it showed bloodshed, killings, war. When I read that book, what was left in my memory were heads of people cut off on plates there. So, in my debate with this gentleman, I said, would you do the same for Northern Ireland? Yeah. And he suddenly said, no. I couldn't because, anyway, Western society itself wouldn't allow. The BBC or any other media in the West knows where the limits are. If there was a bomb or something in Northern Ireland and somebody was dead, there is no way anybody is going to get anything, because there are things like respect of the family. The family will find it, the public will find it extremely laborious. So why do they do so to Africa? They will claim they are trying to show the truth, the facts. But I think where they get it wrong is, you say showing the truth, but is it the real truth?
Yes. Well, talking about the truth, I'd like to come on to you here, Ayo Johnson. I mean, what Vincent is talking about is something that seems to have been perpetuated right from the very beginning of the Western world's contact with Africa. I mean, just to look back at what certain historical writers were saying about their contact with Africa, there were some fantastical descriptions of people with no heads and eyes in their shoulders and all kinds of horrific images. Do you think what we are seeing today is a direct extension from that experience of the other, as we are called, really? It's almost like we are separate in terms of our humanity from the rest of the world.
Yes, absolutely. Clearly, the West, and especially if you look at Britain, for example, their area into Africa, the colonialism that followed then, that mindset is still there. And of course, negative tones, negative messages have been coming out of the continent for some time, and it's quite indicative of the mindset, and more so about the fact that they lack the understanding of what strategically how important Africa is. And especially when they themselves...
Strategically, how important Africa is to whom?
To the world, including the West. Because when you think about how the West try to protect their own strategic importance, and then when you think about their industrialization, the fact that they cannot get to where they are now, especially without Africa's raw material, and the fact that Africa's had a bad tone for some time in relation to that, it just goes to show that there's a lot of problems in terms of getting the message and getting the right message out.
Well, I'd like to bring in Ebere here, our telephone guest. Ebere, bearing in mind, you know, both our guests talking about there being another agenda with regards to the intentions behind these media images and so on. You're an African broadcaster. You work for an African broadcasting company. I would assume you don't have that agenda against your own people and your own continent. How do you fit into the mix of what's available within the Western media? Because you're based here in London. Where do you fit in this? What would someone see if they saw Ben TV that was different from what they normally see?
Yes, in fact, so that's a very valid question you asked. And coming from like a perspective of African broadcaster, working in the West. In fact, we say at my own channel, specifically, is to bridge the gap, because there's a lot of information gap, between the West and Africa. Often it is being manipulated. From our point of view, we also say that there are so many good things that are coming out from Africa as well, and the West deliberately don't, talk about it. So it's high.
Give us some examples. I'd like to hear something positive about Africa from an African broadcaster.
For instance, in Nigeria, there was a whole lot of banking reforms, like, putting from 85 banks, to about 25 banks. And about 4 Nigerian banks, made the list of, 100, top banks in the world. And there was no mention of that. Go to, say, Ghana, and how the election was done. The election was done like, 3 times, and there was no question of like, rigging and all that, all like, very good, democratic practices. And it wasn't even mentioned over here. But if, there was, bloodshed and, cases of rigging and all that, you will see it here on CNN or on Sky News or on BBC. But importantly, the role of like, media houses like us that are African-owned and working in the West is also to start doing some reorientation for our people, to say you don't have to use the Western media to reach, the international community for your programs and activities. There are so many African-owned media houses, working in the West, who will report things the way they are, for you. So that mentality, of our people, the colonial thing that, the West are better than us, let's use their services and all that to reach the whole world.
But you see, part of the problem, I don't mean to interrupt you there, Barry, but part of the problem is accessibility. It's not easy to access these African-led, African-owned, African-inspired media outlets. They're not easy to find, maybe due to lack of money and ability to market themselves properly. So which brings me to a question I'd like to ask you, Vincent, because you've worked, as I said earlier, extensively with the BBC. I mean, what's it like being an African right in the midst of all of that, knowing that you're kind of handcuffed with regard to just how far you can go towards spreading a more positive vision of who you are?
I'll tell you one thing. I've sort of worked with the BBC, on the BBC as an analyst and with on other networks as well for over 6 years, perhaps, or 7 years.
Yes.
At the beginning of my journey, there was almost nobody else who would go on mainstream BBC and African, on mainstream BBC, Sky Television, all these other networks, as an expert analyst of African affairs. In other words, it seemed there was a belief that Africans could not speak for themselves. Because in all this, what we have to ask is, whose voice is it?
Yes.
So I remember some of the beginning things were on Rwanda. And I went on Channel 4, BBC, and all these networks here. And I was trying to put them in context. Because the idea of truth, you're trying to represent Rwanda, the genocide in Rwanda, you're trying to talk about it. Yeah. But is that the whole truth? The truth is about putting historical context, cultural context. Yeah. Because otherwise we're not going to understand it. That is, Western media is very good at just showing the bones.
But did you find it frustrating? Because like you say, they'll probably say you've only got 20 seconds, Vincent, to explain everything.
So you could
only come out with a sound bite.
You had to use sound bites. But it was very difficult for me because even within those 3 minutes of analysis, you had to try and make sure that you quickly bring in what is the cultural background to this, what things are happening in Rwanda, what are the historical roots of it. And also, because it's one thing to report facts and report famine, report war. It's another actually to report constructively. The media can destroy or it can construct.